David, we are looking forward greatly to your arrival in Hong Kong, where I gather you have not been to before. Are you excited about coming to Hong Kong and China, where you will be going to afterwards?
Enormously. For me, China represents a kind of imagined other world. You remember Voltaire used to write about China as the antithesis of Europe, or perhaps the perfection of Europe. For me, it's a world I can only imagine. And suddenly I'm going to be stepping into it. I have the dimmest sense of it, only really from going to the First Emperor exhibition at the British Museum and that marvellous moment on the control of public opinion in which people like me were thrown alive into a pit. So suddenly I'm going to step into that pit and see what that world is like.
But weren't you rather surprised that the First Emperor of China actually burnt all the books and forbid all the scholars to say and write what they wanted to say and write?
No, because totalitarian governments have always tried to regulate opinion. What is amazing about China is how successful it's been until very recently. In other words, it stands really at the antithesis from England, Britain, America, where we've been unbelievably bad at the control of thought and public opinion, for good reasons and bad, and with good effects and bad effects. So this is what I think is wonderful about travel, and this kind of, I would call it extreme travel. You're encountering a radically different world and a radically different tradition, except of course now, and thanks to you, and thanks to the last 100 years, those two worlds are coming together.
Well, I'm very glad, and I mean, as you know, you're coming to the Hong Kong Book Fair. The general public in Hong Kong will be looking forward greatly to asking you and other panelists what you do as a writer. Obviously, your travel to China will be reflected in your thoughts as a historian of the Western world, and I'm just wondering what sort of anticipation. Do you think that there will be a discovery of huge differences between what you're used to in writing and understanding about Tudor history to, say, modern China today?
I hope there are. But equally, I think that the two worlds, not so much of Tudor England, but of modern England, modern China, they of course have encountered already. That is what Hong Kong is. Hong Kong, as I understand it, with that last great colonial secretary, was this sustained experiment in importing the extremes of economic individualism and deregulation into a Chinese environment. So in other words, Hong Kong is a most astonishing piece of cultural experimentation. First it was putting Britain into China, and then, as it were, it's putting China back into China. It's played every game.
You will see, obviously, a modern version of China, having had the benefit, if that's the right word, of 150 years of colonial rule, and emerging as perhaps the most modern aspect of China. But after that, you're beginning to see Shanghai and Peking, Beijing, and you must be particularly interested in what historians in those places do, and their understanding, perhaps, of Western history.
Indeed. But also, for me, one of the huge excitements will be the Forbidden City. That I'm particularly interested in the way in which government and buildings relate to each other. The Imperial City is the most perfectly preserved palace complex in the world, as well as one of the greatest. And to step inside that, however dimly I understand the context, will be simply wonderful. But just going back 1 second to Hong Kong, I think, and the business of colonial rule, what has been so astonishing is, if you look at the two most interestingly fruitful examples of British rule, one India, the other China, what seems to have been the key legacy is the legacy of law and of property right. If you get the notion of an equitable law and some security of property, it almost seems as though economic growth, creativity, flow. Once upon a time, we thought it was all about intellectualism. Oddly enough, these rather humble things, these workaday things, seem to be the real foundations.
Yes. But anyway, we would be greatly looking forward to your coming, and I know that there will be lots of questions, and in particular, perhaps you might just finally say one or two words about the royal wedding, a modern prince, a commoner. Is that a symbol that, in fact, the British monarchy, which is one of the oldest in the world, that people admire and view with curiosity, does that herald in a different kind of a monarchy that might be labelled distinctly modern as opposed to the old?
I think the British monarchy became modern in another great crisis, in 1917, at the height of the First World War, when what had been essentially a German royal house decided it was going to be English. And at that point, it starts marrying English men and English women. But what is quite remarkable is it not only decides that it's English in 1917, it does what the Chinese monarchy was not capable of doing, what the great empires of Europe, the Russian, the German, weren't capable of doing. It reconciles itself to democracy. It becomes a contradiction in terms, a democratic monarchy. And what I think the wedding of the last few weeks has demonstrated is that it's becoming ever more genuinely democratic. At first, of course, it was a kind of oxymoron. It was a contradiction in terms. It was a clever selling line. I think the selling line is becoming real. Kate Middleton, of course, is not as common as all that. She's a woman of serious education, in fact, the first seriously educated royal spouse of the 20th century. But she, of course, represents a world outside the palace. A world outside that privilege, a world that can genuinely do what none even of the so-called bicycling monarchies of Europe have been able to do. She is a supermarket trolley princess. She can confidently walk down the aisle of Waitrose and pick things off in front of the television cameras and still somehow contrive to be common and princess.
All right, let me ask you the final question then. Obviously, you're a keen monarchist. Do you think that China could ever be better if it was under a monarchy, constitutional or otherwise?
Well, China has never lost the monarchy.
Well, in a way.
Either Sun Yat-sen or Mao Zedong clearly were in the models of the more extraordinary and difficult emperors, complete with courts, complete with the whole apparatus of power. The modern Communist Party, as I understand it, is astonishingly similar in many ways to the Mandarinate.
But Dr. Starkey, David, we look forward greatly to your coming, and I hope that you enjoy your first visit to China. But before then, we want to hear your impressions on Hong Kong and what you see there, and indeed for us to ask you about Britain, which, after all, we've had a relationship for 150 years. Thank you.
Thank you.